Keanu Reeves, a name synonymous with humility, kindness, and quiet greatness. But what happens when someone doesn't recognize him? Imagine this. Keanu, dressed simply, standing in line for a first-class flight, unnoticed by most, until one arrogant man decides to judge him based on appearances. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with activity, the hum of conversation, the echo of announcements, and the steady clatter of luggage wheels painted a scene of organized chaos. Among the crowd in the first-class line stood two very different men. One, a tall figure dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, carried a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. His unassuming attire and calm demeanor made him blend into the background, just another traveler, seemingly indifferent to the luxury around him. Behind him stood Victor Harding, a man who never blended into anything. His perfectly tailored navy suit gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Everything about him screamed confidence, from his crisp cologne to the way he checked his luxury watch every 30 seconds, as if the flight couldn't possibly begin without him. Victor scanned the line impatiently until his gaze landed on the man ahead of him. Victor's brow furrowed. "First class," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. His lips twisted into a smirk as he studied the man's casual outfit. "You never know who they'll let in these days." The man ahead turned slightly, meeting Victor's gaze. His face was calm, unreadable, but his dark eyes carried a depth that caught Victor off guard. "Yeah," the man said softly, his voice as steady as his demeanor. "You never know." Victor chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. He leaned forward slightly and added, "Hope you're ready for the ride of your life." But as the line moved closer to the gate, Victor had no idea he was about to get the ride of his. The first-class line crept forward as passengers handed their boarding passes to the attendant, but the air between Victor and the man in front of him grew thicker with tension. Victor glanced around at the other travelers, soaking in their polished appearances, luxury handbags, and designer sunglasses. He loved first class. It was more than a seat. It was a statement. A place for the elite, for people like him who'd earned their spot at the top. And yet, there was this man. No expensive watch, no monogrammed luggage, no aura of power. Just a plain black t-shirt, jeans, and that scuffed-up backpack. Victor's brow furrowed again. "Who does this guy think he is?" he thought, shaking his head. The airport itself buzzed with the sounds of departure, the crackle of intercoms announcing flights, the distant hum of conveyor belts, and the chatter of travelers blending into a symphony of motion. In stark contrast to this chaos, the man in front of Victor stood still. There was an unusual calm about him, like the swirling airport energy couldn't touch him. He looked around occasionally, but not with impatience. He seemed to be observing, taking it all in as if he had nowhere else to be but here. Victor scoffed, loud enough for the man to hear. He adjusted his tie, checking his reflection in his phone screen. He didn't have time for people like this, people who didn't belong. The boarding line opened and the passengers began filing into the jet bridge. Victor strode confidently, rolling his suitcase behind him with the kind of precision that said he owned the place. He watched the man ahead of him shuffle forward at the same slow pace, his head tilting to glance at the crew members who greeted him at the gate. As they entered the plane, Victor caught sight of his seat. 2A, a spacious leather recliner by the window, already prepped with a chilled glass of sparkling water. He reached for his boarding pass to double-check, but his gaze froze when he saw the man placing his worn backpack in the overhead bin, directly above 2B. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath. He stopped short, glaring at the seat next to his. The man looked over his shoulder, giving Victor a polite nod. "Looks like we'll be neighbors," the man said calmly, his tone friendly but unshaken. Victor's jaw tightened. He forced a smile, then slid into his seat, careful not to make eye contact. "Neighbors," he repeated sarcastically, his voice dripping with disbelief. He settled in, crossing one leg over the other. His expensive leather loafers brushed against the edge of his bag as he reclined, signaling to himself and to anyone watching that he belonged here. The man beside him, meanwhile, was unbothered. He carefully placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and leaned back, gazing out the window. Victor's irritation grew with each passing second. This guy wasn't just sitting next to him. He was too comfortable, too relaxed, as if first class was just another seat on another day. Victor couldn't let it go. He had to say something. "So," he began, turning toward his seatmate with an exaggerated air of curiosity, "what brings you to first class today? Win the lottery?" The man turned, his expression unchanged. "No, just flying for work," he replied. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Work, huh? Let me guess. You're a travel blogger, or maybe you work in customer service. Something casual, right?" The man smiled faintly. "Something like that." Victor leaned back in his seat, chuckling to himself. He already decided he had this guy figured out. But what he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The plane settled into its flight path, and the cabin filled with the soft hum of engines and the occasional clink of glasses as the flight attendants began their service. Victor leaned back in his plush seat, surveying the scene with satisfaction. He waved over the attendant with an exaggerated gesture, making sure his presence was noticed. "A glass of your best champagne," Victor said with a broad smile. He glanced sideways, watching as his seatmate calmly folded his hands in his lap. When the attendant reached the man beside him, her polite smile remained. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, please," the man replied simply. Victor couldn't suppress a snort of laughter. He turned toward the man, his expression incredulous. "Water? In first class? Come on, live a little. They've got top-shelf everything here." The man met Victor's gaze with a calm smile. "Water's fine for me. Thanks." Victor shook his head, chuckling to himself as he accepted his champagne. He took a slow sip, savoring the crisp flavor, as if to underline the luxury he was enjoying. "Well," he said, "to each their own." For a while, the two sat in silence. Victor pretended to scroll through his phone, but he couldn't help sneaking glances at his neighbor. There was something about the man's composure that grated on him. He wasn't ostentatious, yet he carried himself as though he belonged there more than anyone else. Victor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "So," he said casually, "flying for work, huh? What is it you do?" The man turned his head slightly, his expression open and unbothered. "I work in the film industry." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, like behind the scenes or—" "A little of everything," the man said modestly. Victor leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued, but his tone still tinged with condescension. "Interesting. Have you worked on anything I might know?" The man smiled faintly. "Possibly. I've been fortunate to work on a few projects over the years." Victor nodded knowingly, as if he'd cracked the mystery. "Ah, so indie films. Or maybe some commercials. Everyone's got to start somewhere, right?" "Something like that," the man replied, still calm and nonchalant. Victor chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "Well, I guess it's a good way to get your foot in the door. You never know, right? One day you could be working on the big stuff." The man smiled politely but didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the window, gazing at the endless expanse of clouds outside. Victor, sensing the man's reluctance to elaborate, decided to steer the conversation back to himself. "Now, in my line of work, it's all about connections. I've been in finance for over 20 years, handling deals that make or break companies. It's a high-stakes game, but that's where I thrive." The man nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. You must work very hard. Victor beamed, clearly pleased with the acknowledgement. Absolutely. You don't get to sit in seats like these without earning it, right? It's all about making the right moves. True, the man said quietly. But sometimes the most important moves aren't the ones people notice. Victor's brow furrowed slightly, unsure how to respond. The man's words had an odd weight to them, as though they carried a deeper meaning he couldn't quite grasp. Before Victor could press further, the attendant returned to check on them, and the conversation paused. As Victor sipped his champagne, he glanced again at his seatmate, who seemed completely at peace with his simple glass of water. Something about the man unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on why. He was used to measuring people by their appearances, their choices, their status. But this man didn't fit into any of those categories. Victor leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Interesting guy, he thought, but I'll figure him out. What Victor didn't realize was that this flight was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Victor sat in his seat, the faint sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his unassuming neighbor didn't belong in first class. It wasn't just the man's casual appearance, it was the calm, almost indifferent way he carried himself. Victor was used to people flaunting their success, and this man's lack of ostentation grated on him. Victor decided to push a little harder. So, you said you're in the film industry? Victor began, his tone friendly but clearly probing. That's an interesting field. Tough one to break into, though. A lot of people try, but not everyone has what it takes to make it. The man turned to Victor with a polite smile. It has its challenges like anything else. Victor leaned in, emboldened by the man's measured response. Sure does. I mean, let's be real. Some people just don't have the right background or connections to succeed. It's not enough to work hard. You've got to have the right image, you know. The man nodded thoughtfully but didn't reply, which only encouraged Victor to continue. I've met a lot of people who think they're destined for greatness, Victor said, swirling his champagne. But the truth is, most of them end up stuck in mediocrity because they don't understand what it takes to stand out. You've got to have something people can't ignore. The man raised his water bottle slightly, as though in a quiet toast. I think standing out is less about being noticed and more about what you do when no one's watching. Victor laughed, a sharp sound that turned a few heads. That's a nice sentiment, but let's be honest. This is a world where people judge you by what you show them. If you want to be in places like this, he gestured around the first-class cabin, you've got to prove you belong. The man studied Victor for a moment, his gaze calm but unwavering. I think belonging has less to do with what others see, and more to do with how you see yourself. Victor smirked. That's a poetic way of saying you don't care what people think. But let me tell you something. Perception matters. If you don't present yourself the right way, people will write you off before you even get a chance. The man tilted his head slightly. And what happens when the way you present yourself doesn't match who you really are? Victor hesitated, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, it felt as though the man was speaking directly to him, peeling back layers Victor wasn't ready to expose. But he quickly recovered, waving off the remark with a dismissive laugh. Look, I'm just saying it pays to look the part. That's why I worked so hard to get where I am. Nothing's handed to you on a silver platter. You have to fight for it. The man nodded slowly. True. But sometimes the fight isn't about what you're trying to get. It's about what you're trying to prove. Victor's confident demeanor faltered ever so slightly. There was something about this man's quiet wisdom that made him feel like he was being seen in a way he wasn't used to. He wasn't sure he liked it. A few rows away, a couple of passengers exchanged glances, clearly tuned into the conversation. One of them whispered something, their eyes darting toward the man beside Victor. Victor noticed the subtle shift in attention and felt a twinge of unease. Why were people paying more attention to this guy? Victor leaned back, crossing his arms. You've got some interesting ideas, I'll give you that. But let's face it, at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words, and money talks. That's what really matters. The man regarded him for a moment, his expression serene. Money can talk, he said softly. But the question is, what is it saying about you? The remark landed like a quiet thunderclap. Victor sat in stunned silence, his champagne glass frozen mid-air. He felt a heat rising in his chest, part embarrassment, part indignation. He wanted to fire back, to say something clever, but no words came. Around them, the hum of the cabin seemed louder, as though the silence between them had created a vacuum. Finally, Victor managed to chuckle, though it sounded forced. You've got a way with words, he said, trying to sound casual. Maybe you should consider writing motivational books instead of dabbling in film. The man gave a small, knowing smile. Life has a way of teaching its own lessons, doesn't it? Victor didn't respond. For the first time, he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, a nagging feeling that he was being outmatched, not by arrogance or wealth, but by something far harder to counter: quiet conviction. The flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses and offering refills. As she reached Victor's row, she glanced at the man and smiled. "Mr. Reeves," she said politely, "the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his regards." The words hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Victor's head snapped toward his seatmate. "Reeves," he murmured. His mind raced. No, it couldn't be. But the flight attendant's smile, the quiet nod from the man, and the sudden realization on the faces of nearby passengers confirmed it. Victor's seatmate wasn't just anyone. He was Keanu Reeves. Victor's champagne glass trembled slightly in his hand as the realization sank in. Keanu Reeves. He replayed the last few minutes in his mind, every dismissive comment, every attempt to establish dominance. Suddenly, it all felt like a colossal mistake. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the unassuming man beside Victor. Some whispered excitedly, while others simply stared in quiet admiration. Keanu, unfazed, nodded politely to the flight attendant and turned his attention back to the window, as if unaware of the growing commotion around him. Victor cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. I didn't realize," he began awkwardly, his voice quieter than usual. Keanu turned toward him, his expression calm but unreadable. "Didn't realize what?" he asked gently. Victor hesitated, fumbling for the right words. "I mean, I didn't know who you were. If I'd known—" He stopped himself, realizing how shallow his words sounded. I didn't expect to be sitting next to someone like you." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "And what difference does that make?" Victor blinked, caught off guard. "Well, I mean, you're Keanu Reeves. You've achieved so much. You're a household name. I would have treated you differently." Keanu smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a weight that made Victor feel small. "But that's the thing, Victor. Shouldn't everyone be treated with respect, no matter who they are?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. He glanced around, noticing the subtle judgment in the eyes of the other passengers. His chest tightened with embarrassment. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only Victor could hear. "I've met people from all walks of life, some with wealth and power, some with nothing at all. What I've learned is that how we treat others says more about us than anything we own or accomplish." Victor's throat felt dry. He fidgeted with his empty champagne glass, avoiding Keanu's steady gaze. "I wasn't trying to be rude," he mumbled. I guess I assumed." He stopped, realizing how pointless his excuses sounded. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression softening. "We all make assumptions sometimes, but maybe the next time you meet someone, you'll see them for who they are, not who you think they should be." Victor felt a lump rise in his throat. For years he had prided himself on his ability to read people, to judge their worth based on appearances and achievements. But now, sitting beside someone who had accomplished so much, yet remained so humble, he couldn't help but feel exposed. Keanu leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. He picked up a book from his bag and began reading, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a passing moment. But for Victor, it was anything but. The rest of the flight passed in heavy silence. Victor stared at the back of the seat in front of him, replaying Keanu's words over and over. He felt a mix of shame and admiration, realizing that he had been so preoccupied with projecting his own status that he had failed to recognize the quiet dignity of the man beside him. When the plane began its descent, Victor finally found the courage to speak again. "Mr. Reeves," he said softly, his voice tinged with genuine humility. Keanu looked up from his book, his expression warm. "Yes? I wanted to apologize, not because of who you are, but because of how I acted. I was arrogant and judgmental, and I shouldn't have been. You're right. Everyone deserves respect." Keanu regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. And thank you for saying that." Victor managed a weak smile, but his mind was already racing with thoughts of how he could be better, not just for Keanu's sake, but for himself. The plane began its descent, and the flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, collecting glasses and reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Victor stared out the window, lost in thought. The view of the clouds breaking apart to reveal the city below seemed almost symbolic, a moment of clarity. For most of the flight, Victor had prided himself on his perceived superiority, but now he felt small. Keanu Reeves, one of the most recognizable and respected figures in the world, had shared profound insights with him, not out of obligation, but with genuine kindness. That humility left a mark deeper than Victor could have anticipated. As the plane touched down, the usual scramble to disembark began. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and reached for their luggage, but Victor hesitated. He turned to Keanu, who was calmly tucking his book back into his well-worn backpack. "Mr. Reeves," Victor said quietly, his voice steady now. "Thank you for everything you said. I don't know if I deserved it, but I needed it." Keanu looked at him, his expression kind but firm. "It's not about deserving, Victor. Sometimes we all need a reminder." Victor nodded, his mind swirling with thoughts. For years he had focused on projecting success, on proving his worth through material things and status. But in this moment he realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't also live with integrity and humility. As they stepped off the plane, a small group of fans approached Keanu in the terminal. They held out notebooks and phones, asking for autographs and selfies. Victor watched from a distance as Keanu greeted each person with patience and a genuine smile, taking the time to make every interaction meaningful. Victor adjusted his tie, feeling a pang of regret. He realized that Keanu's true strength wasn't just in his fame or accomplishments, but in his ability to connect with others, no matter their status. It was a lesson Victor knew he wouldn't forget. Later, as Victor waited for his luggage, he caught sight of Keanu once more. This time, instead of hesitating, he approached. "I don't want to take up your time," Victor said, extending his hand, "but I want you to know that meeting you has changed how I see things. I want to do better." Keanu shook his hand, his grip firm yet reassuring. "That's all anyone can do. Try to be better. Good luck, Victor." With that, Keanu picked up his backpack and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Victor standing alone. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe he could change. Maybe he could live up to the lesson he had just learned. As Victor walked toward the airport exit, he replayed Keanu's words in his mind. How we treat others says more about us than anything we own or achieve. It was a truth he had overlooked for too long. In life, we often measure success by what we have or what we can show to the world. But true success is measured by the kindness we show, the respect we give, and the connections we build. Remember, every person you meet has a story, and how you treat them could change both of your lives. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time, like and subscribe for more inspiring videos.